Welcome to the Cove Podcast, your stop for PME on the go.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Cove Podcast. I'm Captain Todd Lemper, your regular host. And on this episode is centered on junior leadership, but basically advice for aspiring junior leaders. That digger is now considered the leap into a leadership position, completed sub 1 corporal, and moving up into a Lance Corporal position, sort of that first moment where you move from being one of the lads to sort of holding people to account, I suppose. My co-host in this episode is the creator of incredibly popular Instagram page called Tuesday Night Violence Company, which is full of awesome content for gear, fitness and tips. If you haven't listened to his first episode, go back. It's absolutely awesome and full of some gear selection and what you should and shouldn't buy. His name is Corporal Mitchell Clark, and he's currently doing the training sergeant role at 2nd 17th Royal New South Wales Regiment. Welcome, Mitchell.
Thank you.
So I originally asked you to do a gear video. So I reached out and I said, you've got all these awesome, and I want to know why you sort of look at gear the way you do when you do the R&D and all that sort of stuff. Awesome page. If you haven't seen it, go and check it out. You said yes, which is awesome, but you also said that it'd be amazing to come on and do a bit of stuff on junior leadership because it's something that you find incredibly important, and I suppose something that gives some of the listeners a bit more than just what the gear sort of philosophy that we spoke through does. Though you're our resident expert for junior leadership, I suppose.
So I'll caveat this off by saying that when we first discussed the idea of me coming on to discuss leadership, I kind of fell into that trap as well. I was hesitant, and we spoke about that. I was hesitant to do so, and that was because it's not very common that junior leaders actually discuss leadership in such a public forum. It's just not done very often. I suppose it's generally accepted that this domain is better left for like the brigadiers, lieutenant colonels, and WO ones who are far further into their leadership journey. But when I actually analysed this notion, I realised that perhaps the reason I was hesitant to partake is also the very same reason why it's important that I actually put my money where my mouth is and kind of put myself out there and attempt to change that stigma. So here I am, a junior leader willing to discuss junior leadership for future junior leaders.
Awesome. I suppose let's hit you with a hard question at the start. You must go through years of your career as a private soldier, as a digger, and your world is yours, and you concentrate on what you're doing. I've made the step up to the dizzying heights of Lance Jack as well, but like you can get quite jaded at the organisation, or sort of sometimes you're like, I could do it better than they can, and all that sort of stuff. But I suppose describe what it's like for us making that jump from being one of the diggers and then getting your first hook, or subsequently some people go straight to full track.
Well, like every other digger, probably in the history of this organisation, I went through my digger for life phase thinking I was kind of king shit and somehow I can just spend my time whinging about poor performing NCOs, about how bad the system is, being part of the problem without actually becoming part of the solution. I think a lot of diggers get to this stage, and it's easy to dwell there because it's like, I suppose it's not as bad nowadays, but it used to be like it's cool to be jaded, right? Everybody wants to be cool and jaded. I 100% hand on my heart admit I was that guy. Absolutely. I admit that, and I see now that was kind of wrong. It took me a number of years and both some very good and very bad NCOs to finally give me the motivation necessary to complete sub 1 corporal and finally venture down the junior leadership path. When I begun this journey, I realised that besides the kind of one-to-one advice I got from a key few individuals, like my secos and 2Is at the time, I knew there wasn't much advice out there from junior leaders for potential junior leaders, or at least it wasn't widely available. Now, there's plenty of books written by like senior officers about leadership, and they're great tools. I use them all the time, but they don't really prepare diggers for like the immediate challenge or challenges they face when switching from like a section member, and generally they're like the most senior section member, like the most senior private within a section, to that first leadership position, which is generally like a section 2IC or a Lance Corporal. So you've kind of gone from you're the king digger to now all of a sudden you're like the section mum and you've got to look after everybody, and you go from being like really confident to all of a sudden now like the skill set does transfer over. If you're a really good digger, you'll probably make an all right Section 2IC. But there's a whole bunch of stuff in there that, like, say, writing a picket list or organising a support by fire position that you probably haven't done before. So you go back to kind of, you get humbled really quick.
Yeah,
I think that's really interesting.
As your sort of duties expand, it's like, oh shit, there's stuff that I haven't touched before as well. But look, what about that, when you're a digger and then you see someone get promoted and go up, and then there's a sort of shift in the mentality. So they were a senior digger and we respected them and all that sort of stuff. And now they go to Lance Jack and you're like, oh, he's one of the problem now type thing. That's minority. You talked about old school like mentality, but did you see that when you have you seen that in the battalion?
I have a little bit. I think it's kind of all up to you. I think that journey is what you make it. So if you approach that step up kind of hesitantly, everybody's going to see that. I think what you have to do is just have a kind of frank and open conversation with like your section members, which are generally your mates, and kind of at the very instant that it happens, just admit that you don't really know what you're doing, or at the very least, you might know what you're doing, but you acknowledge that you're very likely to make mistakes. And once you do that, that forms like a pretty decent defense for if they ever tried to kind of undermine you, because you've already acknowledged that, hey, I'm still figuring this out.
I'm learning as well, yeah. Yeah, I mentioned at the top of the episode about gear selection on the page on Tuesday Night Violence Company, but you've also done some leadership stuff. Can you talk us through some of the leadership stuff that you've put on there?
Yes, I'll reference a few posts and I'll give a quick kind of summary of what they are, and then we'll kind of come back to them. So the first one I'll reference is a few years back, I made a post titled Leadership, 5 Observations Distinguishing the Good from the Bad, which is simply me engaging in some self-reflection and noting some common trends I've seen in both good leaders and poor leaders during my time. These are people that I've worked with. The second one is titled Personality Triad, Exploring Individual Characteristics Within the Team. This post argues that there are 3 characteristics that go into making a successful team member, and that at a minimum you need 2 of them to fit in. It also uses some popular characters within the popular Band of Brothers series to help highlight what some of these like 2 out of 3 trait characters actually look like. Now, I honestly can't remember where I first saw this personality triad model. I can't remember if I saw it somewhere or it's something I read at uni or whatnot. I don't remember, but I'm sure the version I originally learned was geared towards somewhat of a different audience. So yeah, I digress though.
So that's the good from the bad with terms of leaders, and then some sort of individual characteristics that make good team members. If we go to the first one about those 5 observations of distinguishing good leaders from bad, can you just go through the 5 that you reflected on?
Yeah, so number 1 is your character flaws are your problem and your responsibility. So what I've seen is good leaders understand this and they seek ways in which they can minimize the phenomenon of their character flaws affecting their team. And from what I've seen, poor leaders do not. So for whatever reason, let's say you have a short fuse, like historically you have a short fuse. You need to figure out a way to not let that influence your team, because if it does, your leadership and your team is going to suffer. Number 2 is you set the standard for your team. This one is like probably one of the this is kind of like leadership 101. If you work in a physically demanding job role and you neglect your fitness, surprise, surprise, your people are going to pay you off in some ways. But whether they say they do or not, it's irrelevant. They will. Let's say you're a combat shooting instructor and you're like mediocre on the range. You're not very good at shooting. Would you want to learn from someone who can't perform the skill in, say, a demo that they're supposed to be teaching you? Yeah, absolutely not. Number 3 is look the part. I see this one more of a hack than anything else. So I've used this at various times throughout my career and it's actually worked a charm. So like I run like a well set up plate carrier. My mags are all cammed up.
This is no surprise given Tuesday Night Violence Company is the page you run, yep.
Yeah, 100%. So yep. Like I run like antenna relocator onto my rear plate with like a cammed up antenna. Everything's kind of well set up. My helmet's like gillied up. It's got all the comm stuff on it. And like my boots generally look pretty worn. So I've been in like many O groups or briefings where I've had like very little knowledge of what was actually going on or none whatsoever, or in like situations where I was somehow like way out of my depth at the time. but I honestly can't recall a single time where anyone's actually come to the conclusion that I wasn't meant to be there or that I wasn't up to scratch. So, except me, of course. So it's like a defense mechanism. I would just like sit up the back, nod my head and look confident. And if your subordinates are looking at you, they're like, yeah, he knows what he's doing. Doesn't mean I do, but it's a good defense mechanism, right? Especially for like if you've forgotten something or, you know, you're kind of out of your depth. So I look at that one as a bit of a defense mechanism. So that's look the part.
And that's something like you can control as well. Like it's completely within your control. You get confidence from being set up well and appearing like you know what's going on, whether you do or not. But it's like I think that's completely within your sphere of influence. Yeah.
So number 4 is use common sense, and this one should be self-explanatory. But make sure you know the why. Make sure your people know the why, and use common sense to achieve your tasks. There's no good training value in, say, keeping people up all night for no good reason. So if you don't have to, then don't. Sometimes you can't avoid double handling a task and or timings will blow out. So this happens to me sometimes. And if this happens, I think it's important to at least inform your people why this has occurred, whether it's your fault or not. It gives them a vested interest in the solution. And once you've done that, it's pretty hard for them to kind of criticize you if you've kind of fronted up. This is all the information. This is the why, and away we go. Now, the last one is be the mentor. And I suppose self-reflecting, this is kind of the reason why I, despite my initial hesitance, I'm actually here. So this is the one that means the most to me. So as a junior leader within a small team, your soldiers are going to be looking up to you for guidance, for advice. They're going to be looking for your experience, and in some ways a kind of protection. So show them easier ways to achieve tasks, make them part of your planning when you're able to. You're not always able to, but if you ever can, try to. Show them skills, or hot chippies, as I always refer to them as. Pass on your knowledge and your experiences. Tell them stories. Like, there's nothing wrong with telling them a few worries every now and then. That's fine. It not only makes them better soldiers, but it often creates such a strong bond within the team, and they'll learn to love you in the same way that I think you should love them. You should love your people.
That's awesome. I suppose that's the 5, which are flaws are your own, set the standard, look the part, use common sense, and like you just self-described as the most important one is be the mentor. If we go back to that triad or individual characteristics that make you team members, what was your sort of analysis beyond that?
So the personality triad. So if you draw a triangle and at one of the corners you write professional competence, this is your capability at fulfilling your job role. How good are you at shooting? How fit are you? What about planning, understanding your roles and responsibilities, et cetera, et cetera. Add all those up and that'll indicate some sort of, let's say, a score towards your professional competence. Now at the second corner, write professional attitude. This one's self-explanatory. How positive you are towards your job and your people. How well do you motivate your people? How much do you care for them and seek to understand them? And how hard are you willing to put in to get your job done? Now, the third one's, I suppose, kind of like the joker. This one's a little bit harder to define because there's a lot of things that go to make this up. And in that third corner is likability. This is where we factor in like humor, is he funny? Respect, like your respect for both your people below you and above you, kindness, understanding of others' personalities, and how far you're willing to go for your mates. So now you've got, at one corner of the triangle, you've got professional competence. The second one, you've got professional attitude. And in the third one, you've got likability.
I'm glad you went that deep with likability because like the assumption at a shallow pass is that you're just likable by the others within your section. That's not what you're talking about though, is it?
No, that's kind of like all-encompassing.
You took to respect and kindness, respect for the chain of command or the business that we're in, but also respect for others and all that sort of stuff, yeah.
Now, in between these corners, you've got obviously each edge, you've got 3 edges of the triangle. And that's where they meet. So there's some overlap between, say, competence and likability. So those 2 corners meet on an edge, and that's like you're more likable if you're good at your job, right? So they kind of there's a relationship between the two. Just as there's crossover between, say, likability and attitude, it's hard to dislike someone who tries really hard, and that goes the whole way around. So a good attitude will also likely make you more competent. They all influence each other. The other thing here to note is that your positioning on the scale is fluid and changes as you either become more, say, involved or less involved as a team member or a leader. So it gives you something to work towards. So the theory is that in order to fit into a team environment, so as a team member, you need to be confident that you possess at least 2 of these traits. 3 is optimal, but 2 is minimum. So if we adopt this model into leadership, then I would say that you need 2 out of the 3 traits. However, if you want to be successful as a leader long term, then one of these 2 that you have needs to be professional competence. There's simply no long-term way of getting around actually being good at your job and being a leader in a small team environment. Sure, like you could say, oh, you can just move on to some other kind of staff type role at some other unit and progress up the ranks that way. Yeah, that's fine. But if you're working in a small team environment and you want to be long-term successful working and leading a small team environment, say like the infantry is the example I would use, or other combat called roles, you need to become competent at your job or you simply won't progress long-term. It's as simple as that.
So if that's your analysis and we're doing some self-reflection, have you struggled at any point with sort of one or the other, or trying to get all 3? How have you gone about trying to model your behaviour after the triad?
Yeah, so when I first made the post, I did like heaps of self-reflection on myself and I kind of graphed myself out. And I think at the time, my personal weakness was traditionally likability. So I kind of got to a stage in my career where I was so confident that I knew what I was doing and that I was keen and motivated to do my job that I prioritized knowing my people as an afterthought, right? So I think it's something I've really tried to work on in the past year or maybe even 2 years, and will continue to develop. And as I say, like it's very fluid, so it changes all the time. So where I put myself when I first made this post and where I put myself now are probably 2 different things.
And how did you identify that? Like work out that was actually your biggest struggle in the triad?
Well, I think the good thing about that model is that you can break it down, right? You're literally just breaking yourself down as a leader, and it's very easy. You draw a triangle, and then you can even put some dot points on, like, you know, how do I gauge my attitude, right? What have I done that shows I've got a good attitude? Write it down as dot points, like, and then have a proper self-reflection. If you don't think you can self-reflect, ask your mates. Like, I know it's kind of hard to do, but if they're open and honest, then they'll tell you what you're looking for. And then at the end of that, just put it all together and have an honest self-reflection. Where do I actually fit on this? And for me, like, that's what informs what I'm going to try and work on next, right? I'm going to work on the one that I'm doing the worst. I'm going to fix that, and then I'm going to reassess and see which of the other ones now needs work.
Yeah. Yeah, sweet. I think that self-reflection is incredibly important. It's like a learning thing, and as you go, you get more and more sort of dot points, I suppose, and examples for that. So ideally we get to sit down and we draw a triangle. We might include our peers in and just say, like, give me the sort of serious, like some real candid advice about where I fit on that triad. That's all good in the positive steps and when we have the moments to pause. But like, can we look at some of the hardships, like the hard times that potential junior leaders will face when they transition into their first role? I talked about the digger to lance jack. It's like finally getting rank, and now the rank's telling you to hold your friends to account and stuff. What are the harder times during that transition?
Well, it's just that, the transition to having to now command your mates. It's a hard one for almost all new NCOs, and that's the reason that you find a lot of like ARA units will send new like lance corporals into other companies and all the way up as you get promoted, right? They send you somewhere else, even if it's just another company, so that they start seeing you for your rank, not just who you were. I think that when you do transition, you need to figure out some sort of a switch between when you're referred to as like the mate and when you're the commander. So however you sort that out, but for me, it's just been like when we're actually on the job, it's not like I'm going to be like, I'm not going to not be mates to my mates while I'm at work. But when we actually have a task to do, it's just like a switch, right? Okay, now I'm in charge. We have to do this. And then the moment we finish, it's just back to mate. it requires both parties to have a kind of level of responsibility. And that's, I think a lot of people at the very beginning, they struggle with that.
Yeah, that's awesome. But so you talked about ARA before, shifting battalions or companies. Sorry, you said companies. It's normally companies within the regiment. But so that's awesome. From an ARES perspective though, or like from a reserve perspective, just talk about that same challenge. You can't move because you talked about posting stability and stuff. Like how does the ARES workforce approach that?
Well, some units can and some units can't. It depends on where you are. But in some units, especially within the reserve, due to the fact that battalions are often split across locations and that soldiers inherently parade close to their home location, it isn't practical to move them on. So this means that those individuals transitioning into a leadership position will find this hurdle potentially far more problematic if they don't treat it properly.
Yeah, and differences between ARA and ARES, but like so you've got a brand new land shack, or maybe they're a digger and they know they're going to get promoted, but they haven't quite got the hook yet. What sort of, you grab them by the shoulders and you're like, all right, sweet, I'm going to level with you. What advice are you giving that land shack before they, or senior digger before they promote?
Well, the point I made before I think is important about how this requires both parties to approach the situation as adults. So you need to speak openly and freely, and especially leave your ego at the door. So becoming a Lance Corporal doesn't all of a sudden make you the RSM. Surprise, surprise. Don't expect to go in all strong and all of a sudden start grilling your guys for, say, like minor dress infractions, right? That's not really the way this works. Everybody is going to know that you're going through a journey. So the best defense you can set up for yourself, we spoke about before, for like personality clashes, is to just openly acknowledge that you're still learning the role and that you'll do the absolute best to work for the team and look after them. But also at the same time, make it quite clear that you're likely going to make some mistakes and that as a result for you putting in for them, you expect their support. Like what can you say to that? It's pretty hard to undermine someone who's already acknowledged their potential shortcomings and shown devotion to better themselves and to put the team first.
Yeah, that honesty. It counters your point in the 5 leadership characteristics of like looking the part. That works into certain circumstance, but you're talking about being honest about, I'm going to be learning things and I'm bound to make mistakes, but together we're going to get through it, and I'm the guy. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. So I think that the next hardship they'll face is that they now sometimes become the bearer of bad news. This is like the old don't shoot the messenger. It's a hard pill to swallow for some. However, just remember that bad news ages like milk. So it's simply better to just pull it like a Band-Aid. Keep your chin up and continue on with the job. Acknowledge that there is room within your team for a bit of whinging here and there. It's, as they used to say, it's like how morale is okay if the diggers are whinging. But know what that line is between guys like letting off a little bit of steam and going too far. Like you will be the bearer of bad news. It's fine if they want to have a little whinge, but at the end of the day, like you get to a line and it's like, all right, it's time to just do it. Yeah,
and I think that goes back to your point about switching flicking the switch between different roles. Like you're like, righto, like let it out, and they're all like, this is bullshit, like this sucks, and then you're like, yep, sweet, are we good? We all good? And they're like, yep, we've had our event now. It's like, all right, let's get back into it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, 100%. And like service needs are going to come first. We work for an organisation, the same in like any other job, right? A big one I personally found, and it really took me a few years into my leadership journey to fully figure out, and I suppose I'm still figuring it out, is the notion of like towing the line.
Hard for anyone. It's an incredibly difficult thing.
Yeah, so I was always that digger who liked to have like slightly out of regs hair. My sunnies fit so nicely on my head, so why wouldn't I put them there?
Yeah.
Like I love obviously non-issued equipment, and I still to this day think like shaving in the field is more harm than good because it's like risk of infection, water usage, time usage, you got to carry more stuff, etc. So it took me a few years to fully understand that like despite my own personal beliefs, it's still my job to enforce those standards that have been dictated to me by Army. Now I'll make 2 points here. First one is that becoming some sort of like ADM obsessor isn't the fix for this. If you're going around policing qualified soldiers because their bootlaces aren't outside over in or their PT shirt isn't tucked in, then you're not really doing yourself any favours. if you've just been made up, and you surely aren't doing the organisation any favours. You're definitely not doing your team any favours. This comes down to treating your people like adults and in return expecting them to act like adults. So I always look at like if you're paying peanuts, you're going to get monkeys, right? An additional point I'll make is that you need to know when to and when not to bend some rules. So this comes back to like we spoke about common sense, right? So common sense really prevails. If you're out in the field and say your guys are overheating, let them unblouse their boots. Let them roll their sleeves up a bit. They can chuck a bit of cam cream on their pasty arms and away you go. It's just kind of common sense. And I think some like especially newer NCOs kind of struggle with that. They're like, no, the rules say you can't do that. But I think you've just got to look at these things in context. Like in the barracks, that's obviously not generally acceptable. You need to really think through your time and place for like relaxing standards. But I suppose it's really hard to define, but sometimes you need to bend a few little rules.
Mm. And like, what about, so when someone does bend, so you take a bit of discretion to bend rules where they, you know, where it's possible and taking a more common sense approach. But there's going to be times where you're now section members, you are a section 2 IC or a SECO, and you need to discipline people for bending the rules themselves without the context or without a good reason. And I suppose that's one of the first times you're exposed to, I'm not talking about the Defence Force Discipline Act, but I'm more talking about disciplining, the physical act of disciplining soldiers. Sort of what's your advice on that component for the discipline side?
Something I learnt from like my previous career teaching before I joined Defence was taking the emotion out of discipline. So you can be like harsh on your people, you can discipline them, but wherever possible, kind of offer an exit ramp. If it's like a minor thing, like a personality clash or whatever, try to offer them an exit ramp. I suppose it's kind of like a way back in the team. If you can offer them that, you'll find some situations will just resolve there and then. Another one is make the soldier part of the solution. This is another one I've kind of brought over from teaching, and it's worked wonders. So one that I use with some of my diggers is choose your own consequence. Let's say they're late for work or something like that, and they haven't got like a valid excuse. I'm not just going to go straight away like, I'm going to charge you, like give them an off ramp. And then this is where you can use this as a warning. You can use this as like an opportunity for them to self-reflect and better themselves. And I find if I say, hey, like choose your own consequence, if they respect you and they trust you, and this is gained from setting the example, of course, then they'll likely choose a consequence that is either fitting or more severe than you would have chosen. If it's fair, then away they go. Like they can't whinge about a consequence because they chose it. If it's more severe, I would say counsel them on why you think the consequence should be scaled back. And all of a sudden, you're now the good guy and you're enforcing discipline. So that's something I've used before and it works wonders.
So you would say like what would you do in my circumstance? If you were the SECO and I had arrived late 3 days this week, like what would you do basically?
Yeah, absolutely. And
gives them autonomy as well.
It does. And the moment I suppose it's an opportunity for them. So if you were to say that and they give you like some kind of payoff example and they're clearly like not taking you seriously, well then fine, they don't get this opportunity anymore. And it's pretty good. Like I'd like to choose my own consequences. That'd be nice. And having the privilege of doing that, you would want to choose something that enables you to keep this little thing going, right? So that works really well and it makes them part of the solution. I suppose to close that one, your people shouldn't be scared of you. If you're using scare tactics, they'll just pay you off or they'll look for an opportunity to seek justice. So that's like, let's say you try to scare your people and then all of a sudden like you make a big stuff up outfield and you do something wrong. Do you think they're going to just say, oh yeah, I see that you stuffed up, like let's start again, let's all be a team? Like it doesn't really work like that. So that openness and honesty and like I talk about like loving your people, that goes both ways. And if you can get your team into an environment where that exists, then they're going to stuff up, you're going to stuff up, but you're all going to work it out together and they should not be scared of you and you should not be scared of them.
Yeah, that makes sense. Also, on the removing the emotion from discipline, I think not to cite the mafia, but the mafia motto that is like, I think it's called "Nothing personal, just business." Right? At some point, you need to be like, "This is nothing personal. It's just what I have to do." Do you know what I mean? And it's my time to do this now. If that motto helps to commit a faux pas of quoting the mafia. But yeah, sorry. So you're going to be the bearer of bad news a lot of the time, right? But you're also going to do this thing where you probably promise or try to make things more rosy than they are, or promise things that you otherwise can't give the diggers and stuff. On terms of like doing things that you say, you know, you're going to do, or don't overpromise. What's your sort of advice on that reliability of like your intentions or the words that you say?
Yeah, so that's an easy one. If you say you're going to do something, do it. Or if you can't achieve it, then explain to them why that you couldn't achieve that. It just comes back to being open. We spoke earlier real briefly about like the importance of being on time, right? Like I always say to my guys, like, you know, I don't really like mission creep. I don't like people being crazy early. If you're there 30 seconds before a timing, yeah, good, that's fine, but be on time.
Comes from the Mortimer inside you, doesn't it?
Yeah, like fire plants.
Yeah.
And I mean, accidents happen, like, you know, the car doesn't start or something happens at home or traffic or whatever, and acknowledge those issues, but definitely like exercise due diligence to be on time and arrive prepared. This is kind of the old, like a good digger always carries a pen. It's like leadership 101, be on time, do what you say you're going to do, and kind of be prepared.
So that's becoming a 2IC and then subsequently a SECO. At some point, I suppose you're going to come back to there's a requirement to teach things. Like instructing is one thing, but also teaching people things as you get more senior and experience in rank. And you're going to come back to training or instructing on certain courses. Probably your first one will be an assistant instructor on a course. Subsequently, you might be a actual instructor on a course or go back to a training institution. How do you go about? Obviously, you're a teacher as well, so you've got some theory behind it. But how do you go about like making that jump to now instructing, rather than just if we like remove ourselves from that fire team and come to now an instructor role?
Yeah, I think that there's a few tools that I use for this particular one. So the first one is like the power of visualization and forming neural pathways. So I recall a study I read, I think it was when I was doing my teaching degree, whereby a group of people were taken and they were split into like 3 groups. So one group practiced reps just shooting hoop with a basketball for like X amount of time per day for X amount of days. Another group were taken to the court in the same spot for the same amount of time, the same frequency, but would simply visualize the process from where they were going to shoot, but not actually shooting hoops. The final group was, I suppose, the control group. They had no practice whatsoever, and then eventually they got them all together, and obviously they compared how each group performed. So the conclusion of the trial was that the best performing group was obviously the one-to-one practice group. You can't fully replace realistic training, and that's important for us. However, what was surprising was that the visualization group actually performed like far better than expected when handed a ball and asked to take shots at the hoop. So why is that? Visualization alone, if formed properly and correctly, so they thought through the skill in the correct order, has the ability to form a neural pathway which we can build upon. It's often been said that this is why we often dream about like our fears. That's our brain's way of wargaming perceived threats in order to build up a mechanism to react and to win. So you can use that. And now let's say you're doing like you're trying to plan a lesson, right? So stage 1 is like obviously come up with your lesson plan. But if for whatever reason, let's say you're doing a demonstration, right? If you don't have the means to actually demonstrate that thing properly or that skill properly, you can at least visualize it in your head, go through the sequence correctly in your head. And it's really important with neural pathways that you train this correctly, especially when you're visualizing. And that'll actually make you better at that skill. So it's like free reps, you know, Army's like, it's such like a throwaway line now, like free reps, but that's like essentially free reps with nothing other than your mind. That's a big one. I use that a lot for instructing and it's worked pretty well. So I suppose the second one, the big one is going to be a little bit of a deep dive, is the hierarchy of competence. So I did a post on this pretty early on in the page, which was highlighting the conscious competence learning model. You can like Google this, it goes way back. It seems to be brought up a lot in like ACP and combat shooting continuum right now. But that's the importance of remaining conscious in your competence when instructing. So I suppose the model is we have 4 key phases when it comes to learning any new skill. So an example I used in the post is learning the guitar. And those phases of learning are, the first one is unconscious incompetence. So you kind of don't know what you don't know. Conscious incompetence. So that's you know what you don't know. You know you're not good at a skill. Conscious competence. And then eventually we go to unconscious competence, which is like we can just do something without even thinking about it. So now the reason I say this is when you're teaching people, it's very important for you to tailor-make your approach for you to understand where they actually fit in this, because as I said, your approach is going to have to change depending on where they are. You're trying to bring them up to the point where they're consciously competent and they know why they're doing what they're doing. So a description of unconscious incompetence is that you don't know what you don't know. So the individual lacks the basic understanding of the skill necessary to begin correctly progressing. So some of the observations you'll see in unconscious incompetent people is that they're easily frustrated, they get overwhelmed, and then they generally deny the usefulness of the skill. So this is like you got a new whippersnipper and you're trying to get it working, and for whatever reason, like either the spark plug is fouled or the air filter's clogged up, and you're just going through the instructions on it to try and get it to start, and you're like, this thing's stupid, and then you throw it across the yard, right? The reason that occurred is because you don't know why it's not starting. You don't know to check whether the spark plug works. You don't know whether to check that the air filter's not clogged. So that's a good example of unconscious incompetence. Now, the progression for someone who is clearly in this phase is to firstly approach the subject matter experts. People in this phase should focus on theoretical understanding first before they move on to like practical skills, and learn to understand the why. So once your trainees get to the conscious incompetence phase, we can kind of move on. So the description for conscious incompetence is you know what you need to do to learn the skill. So this, I suppose, coming back to like the whippersnipper, right? This is like that the air filter is clogged, and now you need to figure out how to actually take the air filter out and clean it. So the individual has the fundamental theoretical knowledge necessary to begin practicing the skill. The individual is also conscious of the process that they're currently in. Now, observations with trainees in the conscious incompetence stage, they're able to diagnose and correct major faults themselves. They're able to begin practicing the skill. So they might not fully understand how to do it, but they can start practicing at the very least. They generally have a positive attitude towards learning because they're on a journey and they know that they're going forward. Now, the progression for people in the conscious incompetence stage would be conscious correct repetitions. So this is where you just practice the actual physical skill, but the caveat here is it has to be correct. We talk about like training scars. So if you practice something like, let's say you have a skill and you practice it the wrong way for like 20 years, and then you try to learn you try to fix the skill, it's going to take you like years and years to undo that neural pathway, right? So we need to make sure it's correct so we don't create training scars. And in this stage, I suppose self-analysis and peer analysis is really the key to making sure we're getting correct reps, as is reflection and experimentation. So once we get past the conscious incompetence stage, we get into conscious competence. Now, this is really where like we're getting good at the skill, okay? So the description for this is you know how to do the skill and you know why. The individual has the fundamental theoretical knowledge to understand the skill and they can consciously perform the skill. The individual is thinking of the process involved in the skill as they perform it. So some observations for a trainee that's consciously competent is that they're highly self-reflective. They're able to diagnose both their own and others' faults. So this is where like they get to a stage where they can actually start teaching others if they get to the conscious competence stage. They also understand which techniques work for themselves. So a really good one for this is like I look at like a combat shooting range, right? So this is the person who like they'll do reps, they'll do like 10 reps, and then they're like, oh yeah, the 7th one, oh yeah, I did this wrong. Oh, let's fix that. Let's do it again. And then they do it again, they do it properly, and they're like, yeah, I'm good. That's a consciously competent person right there. Now, the last one, and this is where it gets kind of weird, is especially as an instructor, is when you get into like unconscious competence. This is like you just do it. So the individual can seemingly flawlessly perform the skill without thinking about it. This is like the person who can like pick up a guitar and just like kind of solo to a random song without even thinking about like what chords or what key they're in or what notes they're playing. They just kind of hear it and they're like, yep, this is good. And it does sound good.
And if you ask them to describe how they just did that, they're like, oh, I don't know, I just did it. Yeah.
Yeah. So if they were like back a step and they were in the consciously competent phase, they would be like, oh yeah, that was in A minor, this 7th here, and they'd be able to explain it. But this is the person who they've been doing it for so long, you stop thinking about it. You become unconsciously competent. Now, some of the observations with unconsciously competent people is the brain can process other problems whilst performing the skill without being overwhelmed. So that's good, right? That means, especially when you talk about like combat fatigue or things like that, that's handy. That's good for us to a good skill for us to have. However, if you're instructing, you're kind of going past the point. So it's more difficult to diagnose the faults of others and yourself when you're unconsciously competent rather than when you were consciously competent, right? And the progression for unconsciously competent people is that a master never stops practicing. Add more stresses. So if go back to like the combat shooting example, this is where you would start changing your targetry up or experimenting with like different range shots, like maybe make them have to switch from 1 to 4 times on their sight like within a series or something like that. So you change the environment and you change the environmental variables to continue to push them hopefully to somewhere where they're like, okay, well now I'm consciously incompetent at this other thing. Let's focus on that. But I think as an instructor, you have to be very careful not to go too far into like unconscious competence. I think you still need to think through the skills that you're teaching. That's kind of long-winded, but I think that's very important. That's something that's very important to me.
And I think that's your ability to explain something simplistically gives you that means you actually understand what you're talking about, I suppose, and then constant reflection. Because when people do ask, how did you get there? And you're like, oh, actually, yeah, here, I'll explain it, and really think through and reflect how you got to that point. It helps people immeasurably, I think. I suppose when you are doing that reflection, though, of your instructional skills or the stuff that you're delivering to trainees, there is a tendency to get incredibly confident. I've seen it with some of the visiting instructors from Kapuka that have come to ADFA to help out with the Year 1 familiarisation training. You get very confident and with your skill set. But then some people, some person, another instructor presents a different viewpoint or a different method of doing that. You can get quite defensive. So have you seen that play out and sort of what's your understanding of how that works?
Yeah, so what you're talking about there is emotional attachment to drills. This is something you're going to see a lot, especially as like our TTPs, our SOPs change or doctrine changes. You're going to get people that they've kind of gone so far down a path, it's hard for them to admit that they need to backpedal a whole bunch and then relearn a skill or change their understanding of something. The analogy I use for this to describe this, or I have in the past, is let's say like take yourself back to being like a young boy and your grandfather teaches you how to fish for the first time. You've never gone fishing before, but he takes you out. It's like a nice afternoon and he teaches you how to fish. Now he teaches you like this certain technique of how to catch a certain type of fish, and all of a sudden that is like it's like moderately successful, and all of a sudden that is how you fish. Now, let's say you go fishing by yourself for like years and years, and then all of a sudden, like 10, 15 years down the line, like your grandfather's gone now, and now some like random comes next to you and starts fishing, and all of a sudden, yeah, you're catching like a few fish here and there, but he's like catching fish after fish after fish, and he says to you, hey, like that, that technique you're using, that's not really going to be too successful. Why don't you try this? Like what would your response be to that?
It's sort of like, because you've got the nostalgia of going out with your own grandpa and like being taught that skill for the first time. It's hard to let go, I imagine.
Yeah, 100%. So it's just an emotional attachment, and it's not saying like, don't use that nostalgic technique. That's fine. I mean, you can fish however you want, but when it comes to like our job role and our skill sets, we need to be doing what's going to produce the best results. And I think you need to at least be cognizant that some of those skill sets that you've invested a lot of your time and your sweat into, that they're going to change at some stage, and you need to adapt with the change.
Yeah, that change is obviously not easy, but what you're saying is like at least recognise that that's what's at play, that emotional attachment to your current drills.
100%.
That is absolutely awesome. I'm glad you came on and did the leadership advice stuff. I suppose we went through 5 character traits of good and bad leaders, the personality triad, visualization and levels of competence as well, which was awesome. But more broadly, I suppose the idea is to help people make the jump from, leading your mates to having subordinates for the first time and negotiating discipline and delivering bad news and not over-promising and being reliable in your word and stuff like that. That was absolutely awesome. Thank you so much for coming on, Mitchell.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Cove Podcast. Explore our channel for more great audio PME content. Also, visit us at cove.army.gov.au for hundreds of additional resources. The Cove, the learning home of the Australian profession of arms.